All right, welcome back to another episode of the Director's Playbook. I'm your host, Paul Lovelace, and today we're joined by someone who has profoundly shaped how we think about grief and healing in the funeral profession, and that is Dr. Alan Wolfelt. Alan, we're so glad to have you here.
Well, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for hosting me today. What a privilege.
It's great to see you, and I want to make sure I get a proper introduction for you, so let me just make sure I get this right. But you've been recognized as one of North America's leading death educators and grief counselors. Your books have literally sold millions of copies around the world, and you founded the Center for Loss and Life Transition in, 1985?
That's correct.
To offer education and support both to grievers and bereavement caregivers. And so, did I get all that right?
You certainly did, Paul. It's an honor, as I said.
I've heard you speak a number of times over the years, and every time I just come away moved and just reminded of all the good work that funeral professionals do. And would you do me a favor and maybe share a little bit about how you got into this line of work, and tell the listeners, people who may not know who you are, a little bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to. This is a calling for me, Paul. I discovered it in my teen years after a series of losses where I discovered that we live in a fairly mourning avoidant culture, as people approached me and after a good friend had died and said, well, you're young, you'll have other best friends. And I thought, well, how inappropriate. And then a couple grandparents died, and again, people would approach and say, well, you had to know they were going to die, they were old. And I thought, is that the way we as humans relate to each other at times of death and grief? And so at 16, I wrote a mission statement that I would have a center for loss where I would work to help children, teens, adults, and families to have a safe place, a sanctuary, if you will, where they could disengage from normal demands and give attention to the need to take their grief and to allow it to become what I call authentic mourning. Because if we mourn well, we go on to live well and love well. If we carry our grief, we end up living in what I call in my writings the shadow of the ghosts of our grief. So for 40 years now, it's been an honor to help thousands of people to have a safe place and to train caregivers where we can help them go into their communities and create divine momentum to help people, again, to mourn well.
That's so good, Alan. Thank you for sharing that. I know at 16 I had a paper route, and so not quite the same thing, but yours tend to stick a lot longer than mine did.
Well, I was fortunate people started to invite me to speak when I was 19. I'd written a book about childhood grief, and that became my initial foray into speaking at conferences and conventions. And so what a privilege over these many years now to be able to, again, touch lives and to talk not only about grief, but to discover in my own journey how important ceremony was. I often say, when words are inadequate, start with a meaningful ceremony. So it's been such a privilege to have be embraced by funeral service to be able to speak at conferences, write my books, and to really essentially touch lives as best I can.
I love it. Well, thanks for that intro there. Let's tee this up if we can here. I know you also like to say before we can create a course of action, we need to have a cause of action. You still believe in that philosophy?
Well, I think everything starts with the why, as Simon Sinek said in his best-selling book about, it all starts with the why, is to understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. So I've attempted to contribute to funeral service in that realm by reminding people, what are the functions? Why is it since the time of the Neanderthal that we, across cultures, have had ceremony when someone dies?
Must be for a good reason, exactly. And so I'm puzzled a little bit because today, here's where we find ourselves in the profession. Many families, they're questioning the value of and the need for funerals. They just are. And so I think funeral directors are somewhat trapped between giving families what they want versus giving families what they need. And I think that can help us understand a little bit about the predicament that they find themselves in. And it's a little bit of I don't know what the right word is, a commoditization, if you will, that people just want the cheapest service they can find. They want a direct cremation because they don't know what else to ask for. Are you connecting with that? Are you hearing that in your conversations with families and grief caregivers?
Yeah, I think there's a general trend toward what we call the de-ritualization of North American culture, which is a fancy, again, academic-sounding term, acknowledging there's some converging influences on why more and more people at times will say, I don't need a funeral, perhaps you can just throw a party. And maybe we can even talk about what some of those shapers or influences. There's not one reason. There's a converging of multiple influences that make it a challenging time, but also a time of opportunity if we prepare ourselves with body of knowledge and know how to join people before in any way we think we're going to help move them. So there's some specific challenges that have come about, but it's also an exciting time, a time of opportunity in funeral service, to not just throw in the towel and say, oh, we're not going to stop the trend. I think if we make a committed effort to educating people about why we have funerals, that the future of funeral service can be bright. But we got to get busy.
But let's talk about some of the whys, if you will. So can you explain just real basic for the audience, why are funerals important? Why do they matter? Why should we care?
Well, I years ago began to study across cultures. Was there any central whys to the experience? So while we may use different elements in a ceremony, I was able to discover some specific whys related to funerals, and maybe it'd be helpful, Paul, for me to articulate those for you briefly, and then you can pose any questions related to that. We've had funerals since the beginning of time, one, because we come together to begin to acknowledge a new reality. Someone who was alive and living has died.
Yeah.
We've had funerals since the beginning of time to create opportunities to recall or go backward. Kierkegaard, the existentialist, said it well. He said, when it comes to death, well, life must eventually be lived forward. It's understood and given meaning to backwards. So when we're creating a meaningful ceremony, we want to say, are we building in that backward time, recall? We identify primary mourners and we activate support into the broader community. So another function of ceremony is to activate support, and we do that through various use of elements. We know that a central theme in a macro sense of a funeral is to take grief and allow it to become mourning through expression, mourning, the shared response to loss. So we use elements in a ceremony to facilitate, which means to make easier, taking grief that's internal and getting us started to mourn, which is a good reminder that funerals are not rites of closure, they're rites of initiation. And one of the things we're initiating survivors to is the expression of grief into active, authentic mourning. And another element that I found across cultures is the establishment of meaning. Even in the face of death, we're establishing a meaning of how do we as humans go on living in the face of the reality of death. So if we take reality, recall, support, expression, and meaning, we are honoring what Van Gennep, the man who coined the term years ago, rites of passage. We're bridging back into our community in a changed social status. The key is that we don't expect families to be able to articulate those functions. We now live in the world's first death-free generation. You may have been 40 and never been to a funeral. So we shouldn't get defensive or have an expectation that people understand the why of those functions, which means we have to step into our gatekeeping role if we believe, and that's what we have to ask ourselves, do we believe in the value and the importance of ceremony? And can we dedicate ourselves to learning the body of knowledge and not getting defensive when we know people are going to have opposition to the thought that they should have a meaningful funeral? So that's a brief response to your question that gets me all excited. See,
I get excited too, just to listen to you mention all those things. And I know that I've heard you say that funeral directors are they're gatekeepers of ceremony, and I think that's a great way to look at it, because if we're not in this profession promoting the value of ceremony, then who is, right?
Right, and we shouldn't be defensive about doing so, but we've got to understand that we're dealing with people who, through no fault of their own, often don't have a clue as to why they should have ceremony. So what does that put us in the position of? Stepping into that gatekeeping role and having high-level interpersonal skills to be able to convey value. And that's the key. Taking a look at ourselves and saying, can I commit myself to wanting to be a teacher? That's the key. If you're in funeral service and you don't like to teach, it's probably a mismatch, because you've got to teach every step of the service cycle in funeral service today.
Yeah. And so, well, that kind of makes me think about my next point here about an ideal funeral. So if you were helping a family that just experienced a loss, what would that look like for you? Maybe for our audience who doesn't have a full understanding of that.
You know, I often describe what I call creating the sweet spot of a meaningful experience through ceremony when someone dies. And again, Paul, that's tied, one, to the functions of why. So I'm going to use elements in the ceremony that dose the functions of reality, recall, support, expression, and meaning. And by elements, I remind people viewing us today, that those are things like music and symbols and actions and readings, the things that we know that if we pull those together and interface them with the functions of the why, that people are going to come up and not be able to articulate, oh, I see what you did. You took the functions of why that Dr. Wolfelt teaches, you interface them with various elements to create a sweet spot. No. I want you just to come up like my Aunt Velma did, my dad's older sister, when my dad died, and sum it up by saying, now that was a really great funeral. But here's the key. We have an obligation to know how to create a really great funeral, and we have that body of knowledge. But we've got to be willing to step into that gatekeeping role, to use that term again, and teach people how to achieve that, so that when they're after the funeral, they come up and say things like, that was a really great funeral. And again, I can't say it enough. We know how to do that, but I think there's a void in people in funeral service learning the body of knowledge in a way that makes sure that that happens when they're serving a family.
Yeah, and I love how one of the things I learned from you before, we talked about activating your grief support network. I didn't even know what that meant, but I remember you saying if we didn't have a visitation, for example, how would we be able to activate the grief support network? And I think I never thought about that, but I know families have probably never thought about that either.
Well, that speaks to how there's functions related to the use of various elements of ceremony. So a visitation says to your community, please come, we need your support. It interfaces with the very definition of mourning, which means the shared social response to loss. So if a family doesn't understand the value of it and they eliminate the element, we often find that 6-8 months later they'll see somebody at the store who won't even ask about their mother that died, and I'll say, did you have a visitation? Because it makes a statement to your community that says, please come. To be bereaved means to be torn apart, to have needs. And one of those needs is to activate your support system. So we can take every element of a ceremony and we can teach what is the functions. But here's the question. I meet funeral directors today and I ask them, why do we have funerals? They say, well, they're for the living, and they stop. They can't take each individual element of ceremony and convey value to the family. So when we already have a consumer out there who doesn't understand the value, we have to ask ourselves, can I convey the value? And that's where there's a void at times.
Yeah, I see a gap emerging there, or maybe it's already exist. It does already exist, but families have changed, right, in lots of ways. But the arrangement conference itself may not have evolved much over time, so there is a big gap, right?
Well, historically, back in the Normandy phase of funeral service, people didn't come in and question. They may not have been able to articulate the why, but they still had ceremony. But now we got to theme everything we do with information combined with education, and then honor the choices that the families make. But if you're leaving out that second element, education, you're not doing your job. You're not stepping into that gatekeeper role. So then the question becomes, do I have the body of knowledge and the skill set to be able to be an effective gatekeeper of funerals at a time when our culture's de-ritualizing?
I love that. And if families are the hero of this story and the funeral director is the guide, they need to have some advice, some way to guide them along this path, right? And if they're not doing so, then they're leaving opportunity on the table, and they're not being able to help the family very well.
Well, and that reminds us the importance of training, to not think, oh, I've arrived. And we do have a challenge there as well, because many people say, well, I've been in funeral service for years, I know what I'm doing, and they project that they know more than the family, when we have to remember the concept of let the family teach you their understanding, and then complement that with your body of knowledge, stepping in again to that role of being an educator.
I want to transition a little bit to the concept of efficiency and effectiveness, because I've heard you say this a number of times, and it really was compelling to me. And so can you kind of elaborate what that means or why it matters?
Yeah, I always like to remind my friends and colleagues that are involved in funeral service that a cue that you're going to have to do some teaching is when people lead into, well, I just think it will be easier if. And Paul, you can fill in that blank in many ways. It'll be easier if we ended here, we don't need to go to the grave. It'll be easier if I remember them the way they were when they were alive. It'll be easier if we just eliminate a visitation. It'll be easier if we don't play music because I might cry. So I do a lot of education around not confusing what might be efficient and easy versus what is effective. So if we know body of knowledge about what's effective and we step in again to that gatekeeper role, we're not going to get defensive when people say it'll just be easier, because we live in an efficiency-based culture where there's confusion between efficiency versus effectiveness. So when people start out and they say it'll be easier if I remember them the way they were when they died, I better have in my body of knowledge things like, or our lasting memory pictures aren't of somebody dead, they're of them alive. But how do we get there? By often seeing them dead. Eric Lindemann taught that years ago when he said the point of confrontation comes often when we know in our heads somebody has died, but we move to our hearts when we actually see the person dead. But many people think, well, that's going to be their lasting memory picture, but we know it's not. The central need of mourning is to acknowledge the reality of the death, and there's no substitute for that oftentimes than spending time with the person whose body once animated life. And we want to do that in various different ways through different cultures. If somebody's Jewish, they might sit Shiva for 7 days and 7 nights. Right. That'll help you acknowledge the reality. So we do have to avoid broad, overgeneralized statements like everybody always has to see the body. But my concern related to that one is we're seeing too many people lack any understanding of why you'd spend time with the body. So there's a teaching opportunity. But I got to have body of knowledge to be able to do that. And that's where, again, I think there's a void that we need to stay open to doing more education around.
You've got to be real proactive and intentional about improving the body of knowledge, right? What happens, do you think, when families skip some of these steps? So say that they decide not to have, I keep talking about visitations, but if they could skip anything, they skip the procession. They don't have a eulogy, they don't have any music or any of these elements that you mentioned. What happens? What are the consequences of that?
Well, there's a great quote by T.S. Eliot who said, you can have an experience and miss the meaning. So if I miss the meaning through subverting what we know creates that meaningful ceremony, we can end up living in what I call the shadow of the ghosts of our grief. And while, again, we want to be careful about broad, generalized statements, well, that if you don't have a funeral, you're going to have complicated grief. We don't want to project that.
Right.
We do want to know, though, that when words are inadequate, we use ceremony as a rite of initiation to get us off to a good start. So many families who come to our Center for Loss will come in and say, months after a death, I'm having them teach me about their experience, and I'll say, tell me about the ceremony. And they'll say, what funeral? We didn't have one. We thought it'd be easier. And all of a sudden I discover that the reason they're having elements potentially of chronic anxiety, depression, difficulty with intimacy, they're carrying their grief. They're living in the shadow of the ghosts. So the risk, in a broad sense, is if we don't initiate ourselves from taking grief into mourning, and maybe your listeners should be anchored in that distinction. Grief is our internal response to loss. Mourning is the shared social response. It's grief gone public. So in a broad macro sense, what is a funeral? We are taking people who've come to grief and initiating them to mourning through the use of combining the why of funeral with various elements to create a sweet spot where they hopefully will say, now that was a great funeral. In other words, we're helping them get off to a good start. Many people today are not initiating themselves in terms of taking grief and allowing it to begin to become mourning. So therefore, they're carrying their grief. And if you carry your grief, it can affect the quality of your living. I often say we all as humans have a divine spark, that which gives our lives meaning and purpose. And when you subvert the process of ceremony, you run the risk of muting, if not extinguishing, that divine spark. Out of dark comes light. Out of the use of ceremony, we give people hope for their ultimate integration of loss into their life, knowing they've still been changed forever.
Well, and these are what I would call unintentional consequences. No one intentionally sets out to have all of this darkness, if you will, but it's a result of not doing certain things, right?
Well, and let's remind our viewers today, too, that, darkness is the chair upon which light sits. So when somebody that's been precious to us dies, we're going to do what Carl Jung years ago called soul work. We're going to make downward movement in our psyche. There's nothing wrong with that. We historically were all familiar with melancholy. We wore death symbols like mourning clothes so we could identify who was bereaved. And we affirmed the significance of loss on the pathway to ultimately being able to integrate it. The problem today is we got that sequence out of order. People are trying to throw parties instead of have funerals. People are coming up and giving light-based message instead of affirming you're in the dark. I often think of 3 relationships that we've seen a dramatic shift in that I don't think we talk enough about how that's impacted funeral service. Historically, we always knew you had to say hello to ever get to goodbye. Now, if you have a loss of any kind, somebody will come up and say, oh, you need to say goodbye. No, it's a series of hellos that get us to the goodbye. We also historically knew that you were going to be in the dark before light, metaphorically. You'd have melancholia.
Yep.
You had downward movement again. And then we also knew you'd go backward before forward. We'd stop even strangers on the street because we identified them through death symbols like mourning clothes and said, oh, who died? I'm so sorry to see you've had a death. And we invited you to go backward. Now, many of the messages people get in epidemic fashion are move forward messages. Put the past in the past. God wouldn't give anything more than you can bear. I've got someone for you to meet. Carry on. Keep your chin up. Be glad he lived to be 89. The list goes on that push us forward instead of invite us to follow the instinct to go backward before we go forward. Can I tell your viewers that those 3 relationships, study those in your body of knowledge. Hello, hello, hello is the path to get to goodbye. Dark is the path to get eventually to light, and we got to go backward before we go forward. Understand that in your body of knowledge, and it'll enhance your ability to be helpful to bereaved families.
Really good stuff right there, Alan. Thank you for sharing that.
It might be helpful if we talk a little bit more about what are the converging influences impacting de-ritualization of North American culture. Would that be okay for me to mention? Because that leads to using Covey's principle first, seek to understand. Before you can address what to do about something, you have to understand how have we gotten here. So 1, we live in the world's first death-free generation. Many of the families you'll meet with may be 40 and this is their first experience with death because we've seen a shift in the mortality rate. In 1900, 1/2 of all deaths that occurred in that year, people were 15 years of age or younger. This year, over 2/3 of all deaths, 65 or over. Well, we used to be more familiar with aging, illness, death, and grief. We used to be more familiar with the value of having ceremony at a time of death. So let's not get defensive. That mortality shift alone is a big driver of people lacking an understanding of the why of funerals. A couple other things. Rapidly in the late 60s, early 70s, we lost an understanding of death symbols. We saw the beginning movements away from mourning clothes. We saw the beginning edges of less flowers being sent, which are symbolic of love in many cultures when words are inadequate. We saw in regional areas less food being sent, where we got rational and said, well, they have enough tuna casseroles. It's never about whether you can eat all that food. It's about looking around your living room, your hallway, and saying, look at all these people love it. It activated support through the expression of that. Lack of understanding of hurt, pain, and suffering. As soon as we begin to lack an understanding that there are times when you have proper sorrows of the soul, we begin to see edges where people think we should try to be happy when we're appropriately really should be sad. That's why we saw us move from funerals to memorial ceremonies to celebrations to now the big theme is, oh, when I die, just throw a party. Well, that's ridiculous. Parties are anchored in happiness and joy. You've lived another year. Let's have a birthday party. But when somebody dies, we need to create conditions to befriend our sadness. So when we lose that understanding, instead of getting off to a good start, we are trying to be happy at times when we should be sad. Those are only a few of many influences I've written about in the literature on why we as a culture are de-ritualizing. So those are only 3 of many I would mention to work in your body of knowledge to seek to understand why have we gotten to this point. In understanding that, then you don't get defensive with families you're serving. You go, it makes sense they don't know why we should have visitation. It makes sense they come in and say, don't play music, we might cry. It makes sense they say, maybe it'll be easier to end it here instead of go to the grave. Yet maybe they got 8 grandkids who need to know where grandpa's body's going. So what an opportunity to first study what are the influences on why people are questioning the value of funerals, and then create ways in which we enhance body of knowledge and skill set so that we can help families experience what I call a transformation, decisions that are good for them. I get a lot of hugs from families once I teach them the why, and they carry them out. So if you want a lot of hugs, make sure you enhance your body of knowledge, Teach every step of the service cycle, and you'll have families come to you and say, now that was a great funeral.
That is really good. Really, really good. I just think, as you were talking there, how much easier it is just to do the least. You know, it's so much easier for people to provide just what the family asked for and not what they really need. So if you're trying to create value and ceremony and true meaning, you have to work, because it takes creativity and it takes skill, just the things that you mentioned.
You remind me, Paul, of a call I got after Andy Griffith died from the funeral director that made the arrangements, who called me on a Sunday morning. I guess my phone number was at the bottom of a piece I wrote about how sad it was that Andy Griffith had a pretty much direct disposition within hours. And I was reflecting on how he had touched so many lives, and how that, you know, in Mayberry, there's even an annual gathering of people in Mount Airy each year to celebrate that show. And then Andy died, and he had a direct disposition. And the funeral director called me because I'd written a piece about how I thought that was so sad that we couldn't gather when Andy Griffith died. And he goes, well, shouldn't I have just done what the family asked? And my response to him was gently but appropriately a supportive confrontation of, well, no, you should have stepped into your gatekeeping role and said, look at all the lives Andy's impacted, and now we're going to do a direct disposition for somebody who touched thousands and thousands of lives that people watched every day after school, like I did, the Andy Griffith Show. Mm-hmm. So your comment made me think of that experience. Well, shouldn't I just do what the family wanted? The answer, my friends, in bold is N-O. No, you shouldn't. You should step into your gatekeeping role, use your body of knowledge, and know that at the end of teaching people, you're probably going to increase the odds that they're going to have a meaningful experience if you teach them every step of that service cycle. Do you like to teach? Ask yourself, do you like to teach? If you don't, you probably shouldn't be in the arrangement conference today, because you need to teach. Why do we have visitation? What's the function of music? Why do we use symbols? Why might we want to spend time with the body? Why might we want to have a procession? What's the function of a committal? All those things are body of knowledge issues that I continue to see people lack an understanding of. So how in the world can they be a gatekeeper when they can't tell me the functions of a visitation, or why we play music, or what's the function of spending time with the body? We should be ashamed of ourselves if we don't know that. That'd be like going to the doctor who doesn't know how to check your blood pressure.
Well, we're definitely better than that, and I think families are open to that, and so that's what's exciting. For the funeral homes, funeral professionals that get it, like you said, it's very positive and a good time to be in this profession.
Absolutely. Let's stay positive in that regard, that we're faced with some challenges, but it's a time of dangerous opportunity.
All right, well, good stuff, Alan. Thank you so much for sharing such a heartfelt and thoughtful insight this morning. It's been fantastic. This has been a very meaningful conversation for sure. So to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. You can share feedback at the Director's Playbook at funeraldirectorslife.com. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a part 2 to this session. Dr. Wolfelt will share some practical steps on what to do next in order to guide families along their healing journey. If today's conversation gave you new insight or inspiration, share it with your team, your community, or someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, take care, everybody.